With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today, telling it as it is. This is today's News Talk, The World Today.
Welcome to the Protagonists. Well, 7 years ago, there was the Skripal affair, and we'll talk about why that's relevant in a moment. But obviously, the big news at the moment is the decision by the Americans to really push for peace talks with the Ukrainians and the Russians. And Rubio's down in Geneva meeting Ukrainians. And my intuition, having followed the Ukrainian conflict for 4 years, is that it's it's closer than ever to a resolution, and the Americans have put considerable capital on making this actually happen. Now, there's huge pushback from the Europeans and from the Ukrainians, and the thing that's most people are head up about is the fact that the Russians are a nation of killers and murderers. And I was scrolling some social media yesterday to get a gauge of the feelings about this conflict. The reason why there's so much pushback from the Europeans and the mainstream media reading public is of this event that happened 7 years ago, not 20 miles or 30 miles away from where I am now in Winchester in the UK, a small, peaceful, upper middle class in tone market town called Salisbury, with a very beautiful church and elegant restaurants and a well-heeled inhabitants living a life that foreign people watching their masterpiece theatre productions, a very elegant town set in the English countryside, where 7 years ago, the Russians apparently tried to poison a couple of Russian exchange spies, Sergei Skripal, who with the world's most poisonous chemical substance called Novichok. And it is already 7 years ago, but I mean, a lot of people remember this. It was in the headlines for months that evil Putin had planned and plotted to kill somebody who'd broken ranks, who'd been exchanged actually in a spy swap in, I think, 2010, and then settled in Salisbury, and then had to be killed just because the Russians kill people, The point is, this substance, Novichok, 1 microgram or some minute amount like that, it was sufficient to kill a man. And the two Russian agents that turned up in Salisbury had enough with them to basically murder the whole population of Salisbury. And this, of course, is used as an example of why the Russians are, evil beyond compare, the sort of the new Nazis. And that has been psychologically, I think, in many people's minds, one of the backstops, one of the reasons why you can't deal with the Russians and why the Russians are bad faith actors even now. So I just saw a social media post summing up the average person's understanding of who the Russians are. They're people who shoot down passenger planes. That's a reference to the 2014 shoot down of Malaysian Airlines flight over East Ukraine. We'll get to that maybe in another show. And then this poisoning. They shoot down planes and they poison the British people, poison British cities. Well, what we're going to talk about in this show, sort of in history into the present, as it were, because it's very relevant, is to ask the question of whether this really was a Russian poisoning attempt, a Russian assassination attempt, a Russian, and some people say Russian World War III attack on a peaceful British city, and which could have risked hundreds of thousands of lives, and which made the Russians incredibly unreliable, bad faith actors, and who made the Russians very untrustworthy in any dealings with them. Well, is it as we've been told, or is it something else? Is it perhaps even a psyop, a psychological operation carried out by the British to demonize the Russians? Now, if that were true, then that places the idea that the Russians are bad faith actors in a completely different light, because it seems as the Russians are not the sinners, but the sinned against. And maybe we should be much, much more cautious about calling them sort of Asiatic barbarians you can't deal with. Maybe we should factor that into the other side of the ledger, that the Russians have that grievance against the West, and that has to be addressed at some point. My view is that a peace is going to break out soon, and in the next year or so, all this will come out. I think the Americans are ready for it. They're ready for discussions that are critical of British conduct the last couple of years, and it will lead to sort of, I don't know, a destruction of the reputation of the Western and especially UK mainstream media, such as we haven't seen since the Iraq War in 2003, when there was 2 or 3 years when the British press, Western press said, sorry, we got everything wrong. I think this is going to happen here, but you'll hear it here first. And we've got 3 excellent guests to talk about that. Some of them are experts in the topic. We've got Tim Norman, who is a journalist, a tech journalist with a background in different kinds of journalism. He lives in the UK, and he's covered the Salisbury attack in greater detail, perhaps, than almost any other journalist in Britain. And he's written a number of articles for Propaganda in Focus. You just type in his name or go into the Propaganda in Focus website. It's an article, 3 articles actually, which is your first go-to place if you want to read up on the case. I've referenced it closely, and we will reference it closely in this talk. We've got Oliver Boyd-Barrett, who's a Professor Emeritus in America, who's written a lot about propaganda, and I can recommend his books. He's written about Syria. His most recent book is Propaganda, Communication and Empire, Western Intervention in Afghanistan. He's also written Conflict, Propaganda and Narrative in Syria, Narrative Battles. Now, we won't go into Syria at all today, but we'll just mention that Syria was a conflict which was also dogged with allegations of the bad guys, the Syrians and the Russians, whatever, and their chemical attacks. Well, that was, I think, Oliver, and I may have a separate discussion about that another time, was also a complete bluff. And actually that makes you think, well, if that was a bluff, maybe this was a bluff too. Oliver will talk about that. And then we've got Mats Nilsson, who is a legal historian and based in Stockholm, a geopolitical analyst, and also runs something called the Dissidents Club in Stockholm, a necessary breathing hole for that extremely conformist climate in that country. Anyway, welcome to the show, gentlemen, the protagonists, and we'll start off with you, Tim. Could you just tell us what the sort of mainstream narrative is about the Skripal story for people who've been on Mars, as it were, and then your take on it, and your writing about the description of what the anomalies are in the case that will start to make us question the official story?
Well, I think the important detail that you perhaps haven't mentioned yet is that although the Skripals, the father and daughter, Sergei and Yulia Skripal, weren't killed by this, as you say, fantastically dangerous nerve agent, or so we were told, somebody did die 4 months later, a woman called Dawn Sturgis. And so her story has become the emotional centre of, if you like, the Skripal story. Her death has been subject to an inquiry, and the inquiry is in fact 10 days from publishing its results. So we'll see another sort of uptick, if you like, in media interest, mainstream media interest in this story when the Dawn Sturgis inquiry publishes its results. But in a nutshell, she is said to have been killed by the discarded container of chemical weapon that the Putin's assassins allegedly left in Salisbury, having attempted and failed to kill Sergei Skripal and his daughter. And so this was picked up by her boyfriend. This is the official narrative. He gave it to her thinking it was a bottle of perfume. She sprayed herself with it, which is a problem in itself when you think about what aerosolizing an actual nerve agent would mean, but we can leave that to one side. And within 15 minutes, apparently, she was affected and was taken to hospital, and her life support system was turned off 10 days later. And she's the sole fatality, if you like, in this rather baroque story about not a dissident, but as you say, a spy who'd been exchanged and pardoned, in fact, by the Russian Federation, apparently living quietly, as he said, under his own name in a house that had been purchased under his own name, listed on his own name in the land registry, not protecting himself anyway, not taking any form of security measures, apparently not even having CCTV on his own house, and living there for 7 years or so, and then Well, that's it in a nutshell. These two Russians apparently walk up to his front door in broad daylight on a Sunday lunchtime while he's at home, apply this deadly nerve agent to his door handle, and then go and do some window shopping in Salisbury, whereupon Sergei Skripal and his daughter leave the house, touch the poison, and about 4 hours later are found collapsed together on a bench in central Salisbury, apparently affected by, well, what the paramedics believed was an opiate overdose. They weren't really, there was no suspicion of a deadly nerve agent until about 24 hours later.
And I understand that they, I mean, there's no CCTV footage. This is a former spy, you know, in the most CCTV dense country in the world, and there's no evidence of the two. They were, I think, they were agents, but they might have been on a different mission. But be that as it may, I mean, there's no footage of them actually walking into the drive where they lived, and no evidence of them actually turning up at the house. And if this was purchased by MI6, apparently he was a watchful man. Why wouldn't he have CCTV cameras? And there's no footage of that. There's no, you know, these people with one microgram of this substance will kill lots of people. But they were carrying sort of small backpacks around. I mean, where they're going to fit their sort of the sort of space age science fiction anti-biological warfare bodysuits that the police then were filmed very ostentatiously wearing, you know. So there's that, and there's huge timeline problems. You know, I sort of try and get my refutations on my theory is the beer match. You've got to, if you meet people at a dinner party, as one does here in Winchester, and they fulminate against the Russians, you have your beer mat answer, which is 3 or 4 points where you can say, well, that's not true. And one of them is that there's no CCTV footage. The people where the Skripal and his daughter, age 33, they were wildly different body weights, and they collapsed almost simultaneously on a park bench. There was a British Army toxic dagger exercise carrying on at the same time, or almost just before, which is very highly suspicious because people know about these things, say that exercises precede actual events like that. And I think what was the final one? I think that something like the fact that the Sturgis died 4 months later with this aerosolized stuff that should have killed her boyfriend, who didn't suffer almost anything, and no one else died. I mean, all these people in the restaurant, and they were feeding ducks in the park and gave bread. The Skripals gave bread to some boys, and they didn't suffer badly. Oliver, what do you make of this? Because you're a propaganda expert. You've written lots of books about propaganda. Does this reek of propaganda, or are we being unfair to the British mainstream journalists and their coverage of it?
It just, none of it passes the bad smell test. Everything that you just said, Pelle, suggests that is the case. There's nothing here that adds up satisfactorily that you can put your faith in. Tim's excellent work that I've read in Propaganda in Focus also exposes the extraordinary contradictions here. I've done a little bit of that kind of work myself in my book on Russiagate and propaganda in 2020, and then again in a chapter of my book, Media Imperialism, Continuity and Change. I mean, one thing, just building on what we've just been talking about, the door handle nonsense, the CCTV, the absence of satisfactory CCTV evidence. Also, the fact that we're told, for example, that there were traces of this extraordinarily toxic substance, we're told, Novichok or a Novichok variant. There were traces found in the hotel in which these two supposed Russian spies stayed in London before they travel to Salisbury. So if this is such a dangerous substance, and they've sort of left traces of this substance in this hotel, although it takes about 6 months before the police apparently are able to track down these traces in this hotel. Why is it that not countless dozens of hotel clients haven't at the very least sort of taken sick in this period of time, and why, given that it's so dangerous, why haven't they died? And we can go on amusing ourselves with all of this kind of rubbish, but that's it. The stories are so pathetically contradictory, and the whole notion, for example, that people are going, that two Russian spies are going to spray or in some way apply a very, very dangerous nerve agent to a door handle without really being sure. How can they be sure who is going to touch that door handle? Isn't it possible while Julia and her father are going to dinner that maybe the mailman might come by, or a neighbor might need some some ravioli or something? They want to borrow something. Wouldn't they maybe put their hands on? And how did they know who was the first of Julia and her father to touch this door handle? Could it be Julia? Why wouldn't Julia touch it first? And why on earth would they want to assassinate Julia? The whole thing just absolutely stinks on the basis you only need about 1 minute of thought to realize this is just a silly, atrociously silly hoax. Therefore, I think, and it's kind of interesting, certainly, to explore all of these themes, and one should. But at the same time, if we only focus on those kind of details, I think we're probably in danger of missing the bigger picture. And the bigger picture.
Oliver, sorry, I'll break there because we're going. The latter half of the show, we'll talk about the ramifications, because I mean you're an expert on Russiagate, and it's interesting that Christopher Steele, who was the British MI6 agent, who was wrote this really ridiculous report about Trump being a Russian asset. You know, as if the Kremlin would. I mean, you could perhaps give us the details of that. The point is, Russia, the Orbis business intelligence, which was in Buckingham Gate, MI6 adjacent, you could say. Lots of ex-MI6 agents giving plausible deniability to direct MI6 operations. Well, I mean, who was his best friend and business colleague? It was no one else than none other than Pablo Miller, who was who also ex-MI6, who was Skripal's handler, and apparently lived right next door to Miss Salisbury, and could be seen in the photograph when there's a photo snapshot of them in the mirror. Right? Isn't that right, Tim? Isn't that? I think it was your photograph that provided the proof. It looks like Pablo Miller, and we'll get to the blinking in a moment. But yes, Oliver, we'll talk about the ramifications of it, because I think this could be coincident to the whole Russiagate thing, which of course makes it all very interesting to Trump, you know. But Mats, you've got a very highly forensic brain. What do you make of? We're still at the evidence stage. And I know you've interviewed Tim about it. I know you've written about it and thought about it. What points are there to? Let's say, but I'll be a devil's advocate. Could the official claim have some merit to it? I mean, could the Russians still? I mean, although there's holes in the argument, the fact that the Russians didn't do it hasn't been refuted. It could still be the Russians, right?
Well, yes, of course, it definitely could still be the Russians, but it's highly unlikely, because I started applying my legal education to this. I started becoming very skeptical right from the beginning, due to the very fact that the different theories that was produced from the officials in Britain varied so much in size, shape, and form. I don't think many people remember this, but there was discussions about they were being sprayed by drones, and there was one story about the Novichok was being placed in the air vent system of the BMW that the Skripals were driving. So this sent off alarm bells with me. And then also here in Sweden, it may not be known to everyone, but Sweden is a highly integrated, even before our NATO membership, Sweden has been a highly integrated part of the Western security alliance and intelligence alliance. So here in Sweden, we have one of those laboratories, laboratories that are is connected to the Swedish military, where we analyze these kinds of nerve agents. And the nerve agent from the Skripals was sent for so-called independent analysis to the Swedish National Defense Research Institute up in the north of Sweden. And this is actually one of the institutes that has Novichok within its stock. And I later, with the Freedom of Information Act, asked to see the result of this test. And the result of this test, it was given to me. It said that the sample had arrived and these tests have begun and that they have been produced in Sweden. But then, of course, it was redacted, the results. It said that traces of, and then the rest was redacted. Now, to me, it's very interesting that the part where it says, or should have said, Novichok was found, was redacted. If they wanted to prove that it was Russia, then this part would have been brought to the world's attention. Instead, the Swedish government chose to redact this part. Now, this speaks more than anything against the fact that it was Russia working against the Skripals in so many ways. And it was the same redaction when the Swedish government got the Novichok, Navalny Novichok samples. It was the exact same story. So from a legal point of view, if I were to present evidence, there would be so many circumstantial evidence pointing towards another culprit than the two Russian tourists going there. It just reeks, as Oliver said. It doesn't pass the smell test. It doesn't pass the legal smell test anywhere.
Well, that's incredibly interesting. And apparently the OPCW, which is the International Chemicals Agency, received from Porton Down in Britain, which is British, biolab or whatever, or the chemicals lab, a very pure example of Novichok, which means that it can't have been the degraded Novichok that apparently, which is evinced as the official reason why they weren't killed immediately, because it'd been degraded in the rain. Well, they had 100% purity when it was provided to the OPCW. Could possibly have been provided straight from Porton Down's labs. And the other thing is, of course, that Porton Down, the Brits said, well, only the Russians can produce this. But the very fact that the Swedes could produce Novichok and the fact that the Brits can produce Novichok apparently shows, and there are various experts saying that you can, a competent lab technician can produce Novichok in a lab. So, in fact, just because it is Novichok, if it is Novichok, which it might probably not, doesn't mean it's Russian. But Tim, I think people should read all three parts of your essay or your three-part essay in Propaganda and Focus. And you were probably one of the only journalists who turned up at the Dawn Sturgis inquiry, which is the news peg. But I don't want to go too far into that because it's going to introduce a whole new dimension to it. But although that is the news peg, and we might be able to talk about Dawn Sturgis alone in an upcoming show. The most interesting finding for me was the blinking story. Can you outline that? Because that's something that that is a very, very important piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Do you rate that as a kind of smoking gun, if you like? Tell us as if no one's heard of it.
Well, I mean, going back to what you said about the sort of the beer mat, responses. The basic one was this substance that they were exposed to a lethal nerve agent, or wasn't it? I mean, we were told it was between 5 and 8 times more deadly than VX, which up until that point was believed to be the most, and probably is still the most deadly nerve agent, if you like, known to humanity. And I mean, people need to understand just how lethal this stuff is. As you said at the beginning, it's almost like a nuclear weapon. It could wipe out thousands of people. So anyway, Sergei and Yulia found collapsed on the bench together. That's a problem, as you mentioned, physically very different and apparently nearly simultaneously affected. And they're taken to hospital. And up until the Dawn Sturgis inquiry, we didn't really know what happened while they were in hospital, but during the proceedings of the dawn stages inquiry, there was testimony from one of the doctors, in fact, the ICU doctor who was on duty when Yulia and Sergei were admitted to hospital. And so they were put on sedation and they were put intubated. They had a ventilation in their mouths. They couldn't speak. But 4 days after their admission, Yulia recovered. She was essentially having her sedation reduced in what's called sedation hold, which is standard practice in these ventilation scenarios to see really if she could recover, if she had any neurological function at all. And the doctor absolutely didn't expect her to have any, because he had been told by Porton Down that she had been exposed to a nerve agent like VX, and therefore he effectively thought she would be brain dead. And she wasn't at all. He said, I was gobsmacked at how neurologically intact she was, and he was able to communicate with her by asking her to blink, because he was a very experienced ICU consultant. He'd obviously dealt with patients in these kind of situations before. And so she did blink in response to his questions. And he actually asked her if she was sprayed, and she blinked yes. And then he asked her if she was sprayed in the restaurant. I think by this time he must have been told, he clearly had been told by Porton Down as a nerve agent. He must have speculated for himself how this could have transpired, that her and her father. So a spray would be not an unreasonable assumption for him to make. So he asks her, were you sprayed? And she blinks yes, at which point her sedation is increased and she returns to unconsciousness. And 2 points apart from obviously the very interesting fact that she blinked, that she was sprayed in the restaurant, is simply the fact that she wasn't immediately put on a rehabilitation program. At this point in a hospital, when somebody recovers and shows high neurological function, you would expect them to be almost immediately put on a rehabilitation program and taken off ventilation as soon as possible. Instead of which, the doctor was removed from the ICU roster completely and effectively threatened by the medical director of the hospital with professional misconduct if he talked to any of his colleagues about this blink interview episode. And he was removed and effectively silenced and wasn't allowed to return to the ICU until after Sergei and Yulia had been discharged.
Wow. And, he left the hospital. I mean, he was a very senior, very experienced doctor, and he was bollocked basically and told you mustn't go there. And I mean, the way it's written up in the inquiry, I mean, you reference your article so people could go to the transcripts of the inquiry, was that it's almost like a cliffhanger, because he says, did it happen in the restaurant? And she blinked, yes. Were you sprayed in the restaurant? She blinked, yes. And she said, do you know who sprayed you? At which point the conversation trails off because she started to go back into sedation again. So we're left with that possibility that, I can't remember. Did she blink yes that she knew who'd sprayed her? I can't remember anyway, but it was like one of those cliffhangers, because would two Russian agents, goons, turn up at the restaurant, inveigle themselves into the table and spray her, or would it possibly be their table companion, who was none other than Pablo Miller,
Well, I mean, just to clarify quickly about that photograph, that photograph is from an earlier occasion when they were at the same restaurant, and the picture was taken by Yulia's brother. It's often mistaken to be Pablo Miller. It was not. It was Yulia's brother, who subsequently passed away.
Oh, okay, right. Well, good to see that. Although they did resemble the picture of Pablo Miller. Okay, good to have that cleared up. So anyway, I mean, let's say it could be the Russians, but would the Russians, they had CCTV in the restaurant, would they not? Or at least outside or somewhere, and there's no evidence of them sneaking up on the couple or the daughter and father sitting there. Anyway, so and then of course did Yulia have a chance to talk about it? I mean, she woke up out of sedation. I mean, a conspiracy theorist might say they were kept sedated for as long as the OPCW were investigating this thing, and then they were brought into. So basically, I mean, it's a huge case of medical misconduct. I mean, basically, they were sedated so that they wouldn't talk. Basically,
it does seem to be the case, absolutely. And I'm in tiny detail to add before I don't want to take over, but. Is that Yulia had a tracheostomy. She was seen in the photographs afterwards with a very prominent scar on her throat. And this tracheostomy was given to her, in fact, the day before OPCW came to Salisbury to investigate the case and take samples. It's only 6 days before she was discharged. She was actually almost on the point of complete recovery. So that in itself is a rather sort of suspicious little and rather gruesome detail that implies that she was effectively physically prevented from talking by having a hole put in her throat.
Wow. Okay, gentlemen. I mean, we're going to move on from the evidence story. Is there anything any of you want to add about the evidence that the technical story?
Yeah,
Oliver?
may I?
Yeah.
Do you mind if I just quickly, because I'm not quite sure we have explicitly said, have we, that Pablo Miller was the one who originally recruited Sergei Skripal as a double agent for MI6. I think, and also, as you did say, but I think it's so important that at that time. Christopher Steele was with the MI6 in actually head of the Russian desk, I believe, in Moscow. And that Pablo Miller later on worked for Christopher Steele's company Orbis. That kind of relates this whole narrative in a tangential way to the Russiagate saga, which had started already, of course, in 2016, a couple of years before what we're talking. But the other thing, if you don't mind, if I just quickly want to insert here, you did raise the OPCW, and it is the OPCW. By the way, several weeks after Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson and Prime Minister Theresa May have assured the British public that, of course, it must have been the Russians, because only the Russians could possibly do this kind of thing. And then, but this is before there's actually any evidence. This is before we've even heard from Porton Down, what Porton Down's conclusion.
I'll just sum up. I mean, what we've got, the evidence points to something really, really dodgy here. We're now, for the second half of the show, we're going to talk about the effects of this on Western relations with Russia and where we are today, because it's going to it's still a toxin in East-West relations, and I'm wondering whether. If they're rolling up the whole Russiagate story in America at the moment, little reported on, whether this will be included in that story. Matt, what do you think?
I think that will always be one of those go-to stories when they are in need of reminding people about the perceived evils of the Russian Empire. It's always a good propaganda tool to pick up, because the narrative is basically set in stone. Like you say, when you go to dinner parties or when you meet people, it's always the same. Russia shoots down the planes. Russia bombs markets with rockets, and Russia poisons people in the West. Now, even though it's basically like being an atheist and talking to someone who is of a religious affliction, even though that you have deconstructed the stories about the religion, and you can say that this and this story isn't true, there's no proof, you still can never convince someone who is a believer by faith. You can't really make legal arguments when someone has the faith that something is wrong. So from a legal perspective, there are so many strains to the official narrative that it should be obvious for everyone that the story as it's presented can't be true. But that doesn't matter. The details don't matter anymore, because the propaganda apparatus of the West has been so efficient. And this is, something that Oliver's books and his research has proven time and time again. So it's an uphill battle. Basically, where we were talking about this are charging the windmills in a struggle to try and put the facts out there, but it's not really going to help until the BBC realizes that we can't continue to lie, which I don't find that happening anytime soon, unfortunately. So yes, this will be raised when it's deemed necessary to keep the anti-Russian story going. The Skripal affair will always be there. The MI17 affair will always be there. The attacks on civilian population areas in Ukraine, it will always be there to pick up and to be used.
It's interesting because one of the big stories in the last couple of weeks has been the BBC's, alleged lies about a lot of things. They edited a documentary about Trump in the January 6th insurrection to make it seem he was much more aggressive than he actually was, and then the host of points that the BBC won't confront in a factual manner. Let's say the transgender issue, maybe the climate issue. Actually, I do believe there is climate change, so I'm on a spectrum on that issue. But let's say there's a 19-page report by Michael Prescott, who's an internal advisor, which wasn't talked about inside the BBC, so he decided to leak it to the Telegraph. So there's a big story now about whether the BBC should be dismantled. The left-right issue, the left saying the BBC is essential, the right saying it's all propaganda. But it's interesting that the whole entire British media establishment has agreed not to talk about all of theirs lies about the Ukraine war. So, I mean, although the Telegraph has some points when it's BBC bashing, what it doesn't talk about is the fact that the BBC and the Telegraph and the Guardian and everyone across the whole spectrum in Britain has agreed not to examine critically the propaganda around the Ukraine war. And it's interesting because BBC's Mark Urban was with the Skripals, or talking to the Skripals, making documentaries about them, and the BBC's also made this drama documentary. And the thing about drama documentaries or dramas is that you instantiate a lie, and then when you say, well, that's not true, and then you can say, well, that's just for dramatic effect, and we had to make it interesting for the people. And it's probably true that most people's versions of history come from watching dramas, and people who write dramas always have this alibi that it's just fiction, And so the dramas about the Skripal affair will long outlast our efforts, and it'll become official history. But anyway, I mean, Oliver, I don't know, anyone could jump in here, but there were two Russians of a sort of military combat special forces type, I would say. They did fly in from Moscow. They did walk around, apparently sightseeing, but probably not. They were 200 or 300 meters away at a petrol station, but were now not seen any closer to the house. They were interviewed by Russia Today and looked a bit shifty about it, and then. But then they stayed at a hotel in London, and apparently took prostitutes and smoked drugs, which is not exactly the professional GRU agent. What was really going on? I mean, were they entrapped or something? Were they on another mission, or were they on an assassination mission? I mean, Tim, what do you think?
It does appear, or certainly a plausible alternative view, is that they are patsies, that they've been set up. The British knew they were coming. And they were there to speak to Skripal, communicate with Skripal, possibly about the Steele dossier, as Professor Boyd-Barrett was referring to. In fact, this is a good example of this sort of media kind of imperialism that he talks about, because there was a sort of a kind of omerta across the whole of the mainstream media that this was not to be held in question. Even though at the outset, Theresa May actually did raise the possibility that it might not have been Russia. She said possibly Russia's lost control of its stocks of this stuff. Those are the two alternatives offered. Clearly, there are many others, but she did actually offer an alternative herself, which was then sort of quietly forgotten, this possibility that it could have been somebody other than the Russian state who'd somehow gotten hold of this stuff, which, like you say, could have been produced by anybody. So, yes, I mean... There was just one or two. There was a woman called Mary Dejevsky in The Independent who wrote a couple of sceptical articles, and the great Guardian investigative journalist Nick Davis, who was not by that time retired, he highlighted this. He said it was like the WMD lies. He in his book Flat Earth News, he was being interviewed about it, and he said it was such a low level of investigation, similar to the WMD deception.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I mean, but if they turned up in Salisbury, I mean, were they hoping to get Skripal to re-defect? Were they going to try and get a revelation from Skripal that this Russiagate thing had been cooked up by Orbis to destroy Trump?
But that's, I mean, following from what Professor Boyd-Barrett was saying, that is the alternative hypothesis that Skripal would have been used because Pablo Miller, as Professor Boyd-Barrett was saying, was working with Christopher Steele. And you have this connection as well with Mark Urban, who was also in the tank regiment with Pablo Miller back in the 70s. So there's a sort of sort of three-way little kind of media pincer movement there, where yes, Skripal would have been involved, perhaps very likely, in making the Trump dossier sound, if you like, more authentically like a bit of Russian intelligence, whereupon Trump becomes president and Skripal finds himself sitting on some very nice, juicy secrets to sell, which is, after all, what he did his entire career.
Yeah.
Right. Is that what you think, Oliver?
I think that's very plausible. And if I could just, I would like to make some things to some other things that are going on here. We've talked about the role of the OPCW in this saga, and within days of this event, we have the false flag chemical weapons attack in Duma in Syria. And the OPCW there, as on other occasions with respect to chemical weapons attacks in Syria, the OPCW is the one that judges that chemical weapons were used, and the finger is usually pointed towards the Assad regime, even though it's well known that the jihadists have access to sarin and chlorine and other ingredients for chemical weapons. But the Duma attack, or the alleged chemical weapons incident in Duma in April 2018 is the one that becomes very, very important, because this is the one where the OPCW actually cannot successfully translate the lie, so to speak, because some of its own inspectors contest the organization's own conclusions that this is actually evidence of a chemical weapons attack by the regime, and as a result of that, and Pierce Robinson of Propaganda in Focus has been a major figure, I think, in exposing the OPCW here. It's as a result of this that we begin to see a crumbling of the credibility of these UN related organizations. The IAEA might be another one. So, I mean, although I totally can, part of me is can very easily be persuaded to be pessimistic about the likelihood that history will forever be written falsely, and our voices will count for nothing at the end. But a part of me is kind of optimistic. At this time in history, it's a progressive, it's an incremental process, but I think it starts in 2003 with the breakdown of the weapons of mass destruction lie. And then over the next 10 to 20 years, we see a more and more aggressive contestation of these lies. Now, part of the establishment reaction to this growing public awareness of how the propaganda games are played, I think, is to try to play ever more sophisticated and dirtier games. And one example of that, I think, would be the British involvement in setting up the white helmets in Syria, which also ties into the Duma story, because the white helmets are said to have been the ones who manufactured the so-called evidence of a chemical weapons attack in Duma. It's a very, very dirty story, because it also involves the massacre of dozens of other people, but that gets too complicated. We can't really go down.
Well, so basically, Duma was an attempt, a false flag, if you like, by the British to get Americans involved to destroy the Syrian regime, because over false allegations that use a highly toxic sarin, when in fact the OPC couldn't find any evidence of sarin. And some witnesses said that the white helmets, these first responders about whom a Netflix film was made, the usual crap, and they turned up and they were throwing water at all these people who were in a shelter, and the white helmets were filming this simultaneously. And then it was all sort of turned into YouTube and TikTok videos as the white helmets responding to a sarin attack when they're actually causing the problem, and filming a kind of fake story about it. And And then the OPCW, some independent inspector said, well, all we found on site was no sign of sarin, possibly some evidence of chlorine or something like that, which is found naturally. So, what Oliver was saying was this happened almost simultaneously with the attack in Salisbury, showing that there was things going on in the Western intelligence agencies, a concerted attempt, because of course behind the Syrians were the Russians, and if you could topple the Assad government, you could get the Russians out of the Middle East, you know. And the British have had this obsession with Syria for decades. I mean, why can't they leave it alone? I mean, I was reading about the Suez crisis, they were trying to topple the Syrians in 1956. But anyway, we're going to kind of slowly wind up here, because I don't want to be accused of being. I'm trying to get to the truth, what really happened. That's what journalists should do and historians should do. And we know. I mean, the Russians are not babes in the wood. You know, I think it's an intelligence war. I think that just because the West does bad things and then pins it falsely on the Russians doesn't mean the Russians don't do bad things. There's a logic, doesn't follow logically that they're completely innocent. We've had the story about the Skripals, even if it was proven not to be the Russians. Can we say the same? And we've got the poisoning of Navalny, we've got the death of Navalny, the sort of opposition figure, if you like, the next president after Putin who died. And then we've got the Litvinenko, which is when he supposedly died in a very, who was this sort of dissident, and who can forget, it's probably one of the most famous news pictures of the century, this man, bald man, dying of polonium poisoning in some hospital somewhere. Well, Mats, have you got thoughts about the various other bad things the Russians have been accused of? Are you as sure about that as you are about Skripal?
One can never be sure about anything, because the facts are hidden. You have to remember that very few of these cases actually go to court, and the ones that do don't end up with the conclusions that were initially presented to the audiences. My take is that, I mean, the modus operandi fits into the British Security Service workings. I mean, you have to remember that the UK security forces have had this kind of stories for decades. There was I can't remember which year it was, but there was something called the Easter bomb plot in Manchester. I think this was the time of Gordon Brown being the Prime Minister. And this was, plastered as a very big terror bomb plot. And then it emerged that it had just been basically a kitchen. I mean, the thing that was confiscated was sugar in normal quantities. And then you had the terror plot, another terror plot, which again was they were trying to create something called ricin. I think it was one of these substances that was going to kill people. And this was when the Iranians and the terrorists were the bad guys. Now it's just shifted to make the Russians the bad guys. So evidence when it comes to the inner workings of the Western security apparatus points to that they are fully capable of concocting these kind of elaborate lies in order to produce an environment where they're able to push a policy of hostility towards a new enemy in order to keep whatever momentum they want to achieve going. In this case, it's probably that old British vision of dismantling Russia into small pieces, making Russia basically a Yugoslavia of disintegrating warring states, which I believe is probably the end game. And the Skripals is just a small piece of this greater goal that the British intelligence apparatus is working towards. So I think, yes, Russia does bad things, but they do so in more of a defensive posture against a very aggressive Western intelligence service war.
Well, my general feeling is that it's like a bar fight where you only film half the side. Like the Brits and the Americans throw the first punch, Russians do something, and the Western media, having lied about the first thing, also proceed to not provide context about the response. So you get, it's not as if Russia woke up one morning and decided to invade Ukraine, and that's for the babes. It's a very, very complex process of punch and counterpunch. Well, Tim, I mean, do you have any view on the Navalny and even the Litvinenko? I'm not an expert on either, actually, but I'm open.
I'm not an expert on either although they were used, if you like, to construct, shall we say, the presumption of guilt. And the Navalny case is a particularly interesting one in that it involves Bellingcat. We haven't talked about them, but they're, I would say, a sort of proxy for the British intelligence services, or at least acted in that way. And they give a very confused narrative, actually, about Navalny in this documentary, the Navalny documentary, which won an Oscar, won a BAFTA, and was seen, to be a truthful telling, I suppose. But they have a very confused narrative about Novichok, particularly. Though obviously Novichok isn't really the name of this substance, but yes, they get terribly confused about whether or not it leaves traces in the body. The Bellingcat person tries to pretend it's a sort of ultimate assassination weapon, such that every trace disappears from the body, and your victim appears to have died a natural death. But that's by the way. I mean, as Matt says, the Skripal case was preparing the ground. It was manufacturing consent, if you will, to use the sort of the phrase, in the British public for as then it was, coming war in Ukraine. And again, it will be wheeled out. And in fact, as I said at the beginning, the inquiry is about to publish its conclusions in 10 days' time on the 4th of December. And we will see once again, as Craig Murray, another great writer about this, says, a sort of festival of Russophobia will be sort of whipped up around the publication of this report, which will not question the fundamentals and the very obvious problems with the narrative at its core.
Well, I mean, so I guess in 10 days' time, people who watch this show will be going to Propaganda in Focus and to Craig Murray's blog to find out what really went on, But yeah, it's terrible. I mean, the COVID inquiry just published its findings, and it didn't say. I mean, Sweden actually got it right. I mean, Swedes are often accused of being conformist and sort of lapdogs of the British and so on. But actually, they did absolutely the right thing during COVID. They didn't lock down, and they had the lowest excess mortality rate in the world, I think. And people going to restaurants and living pretty normally. I mean, there's some restrictions, but small restrictions. And they also had the smallest hit economically. But this was nothing to be found in the COVID inquiry. The British concluded that more lockdowns would have been better, even though none of the evidence points to it. So, I mean, that COVID inquiry costing hundreds of millions of pounds was just a whitewash. So, I mean, you can't trust these official inquiries. And when the Sturgis inquiry comes out in 10 days' time, we'll see, as you said, probably a lot of enabling propaganda, and just a few independent journalists will really be questioning that. But just, Oliver, to give some final thoughts to you, what are your thoughts on Navalny and Litvinenko? Because some people are going to say, well, just because the Skripal was a lie doesn't mean it was all a lie, all the allegations against the Russians.
I think a lot of those supposed Russian assassinations of exiles in London are probably counterfeit, Litvinenko included. We had a committee of inquiry, and as we've just said, you just can't trust committees of inquiry. They're so easy to set up in the way that to get the answers that you want. Although we also, Tim just a moment ago mentioned the role of Bellingcat.com, and interestingly, that they were formed just before the MH17 event occurred, and almost as though by magic, they already have the total narrative worked out almost instantaneously, which is immediately digested and regurgitated by the British press, which points more than points, just accuses Russia basically of maliciously shooting down this civilian airline, because that's the kind of thing that Russians do. So Bellingcat.com, I think, is, as is often described, I believe correctly, to be a sort of intelligence cutout, MI6 cutout. But the thing, MH17 also tells us, however, it's pretty easy to set up committees of inquiry to produce the results that you want. But it's pretty easy also to bring things to court and to get the judgments that you need. I mean, we saw that with Assange. We saw it with MH17. We're living in a world not only of, in my view, totally disreputable and dishonest people, but also we're living in the West. We're living in a world which is totally bamboozled and idiotified, if you will, by centuries of propaganda. I mean, this is academically the most interesting thing about this whole thing, to my mind, is just for how long the British in particular, more than anybody else, the British have engaged in a propaganda campaign against Russia. It goes back, obviously, to the Crimean War, and it probably goes back before the Crimean War. And every one of these propaganda campaigns feeds into the next propaganda campaign. The propaganda never dies. So you've got generations of Brits and of other people in the West who've been absorbing this make-believe fantasy about what the nature of Russia is.
And I just a concluding comment. I mean, I wrote a lot about the run up to World War One, and it was basically, I mean, the Germans were much more innocent than we think. But I was researching the British propaganda campaign against the Germans in the years 1901 to 1914, and it's very similar to the campaigns against Russia. So people might say, well, okay, the British use propaganda against the Russians, but the Russians are a bit barbaric, aren't they? Okay, but the point is, the Germany in 1901 was winning all the Nobel Prizes, far more democratic than we think. They had the general vote for all men in the Reichstag. It was only in Prussia there was a restricted vote. But if somehow people today, even in 2025, think of Germany as run by sort of proto-Hitler, and that the Kaiser Wilhelm was basically a road to German autocracy. But the same othering of the Germans are barbarian, they're people of the East. Well, I mean, today it's the Russians are the people of the East, not like us, democratic British and French, the liberal democracies versus the Easterners, And and it's very dispiriting, because even though Germany has been the ideal pupil in the class for 80 years and gone along with all the propaganda against them, basically internalized that, like the total victims that they are, they still aren't let off. They still are the history. Still, if you pick up a Max Hastings book in your local Winchester library, which is doing very well because Winchester's a military town and they suck up to all this stuff, you'll read that the Germans started World War One. It was completely unprovoked. The Kaiser woke up one morning and decided to invade plucky little Belgium. That's all bollocks. Anyway, gentlemen, thank you all so much for extremely stimulating conversation. Oliver Boyd-Barrett, Matt Snilson, and Tim Norman. You can find them just by Googling and the various outlets. Excellent talk, and thank you very much.